Hey guys, tonight we journey back to a Europe where the law could seem as mysterious as the forests that covered the hills, where a person's ordinary morning might suddenly become complicated by a rule that today feels almost impossible to believe. Before you settle in, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, only if you genuinely enjoy these quiet journeys into history. Now dim the lights, get comfortable, perhaps pull the blanket a little closer, and let us slowly wander into a medieval world where justice was often practical, sometimes deeply symbolic, and occasionally so unusual that even modern historians pause to understand why such laws ever existed. When many people imagine medieval Europe, they picture towering castles, armored knights, bustling markets, and villages gathered beneath church bells. Those images are not entirely wrong. Yet daily life was shaped far less by dramatic battles than by countless local rules that governed nearly every ordinary activity. Medieval law was rarely one single legal system. Instead, every kingdom, duchy, bishopric, county, manor, and independent town often maintained its own customs. What appeared perfectly reasonable in one valley could seem completely absurd only a day's journey away. This remarkable diversity explains why historians continue discovering legal records that surprise modern readers. Medieval lawmakers were not attempting to entertain future generations. They created regulations to solve immediate problems facing their own communities. Sometimes, those problems involved livestock wandering into neighboring fields. Sometimes, they involved maintaining public order during religious festivals. Occasionally, they reflected fears that today no longer exist. When viewed through modern eyes, however, many of these regulations appear wonderfully strange. Understanding these unusual laws requires leaving behind modern assumptions. Governments during the Middle Ages rarely possessed large professional police forces. Communication traveled slowly. Written records remained limited outside important institutions. Many communities relied upon neighbors watching one another, local officials interpreting customs, and public ceremonies reminding everyone of expected behavior. Law, therefore, became deeply connected to everyday social life, rather than existing as a distant collection of statutes stored in government buildings. Imagine waking before sunrise in a small English village during the 13th century. The smoke from household fires drifts quietly above thatched roofs. Chickens wander freely between cottages. A blacksmith already begins striking heated iron, while bakers prepare bread long before daylight fully arrives. Nearly every familiar activity exists within a framework of obligations inherited across generations. Some rules concern taxes. Others regulate farming. Still others determine when mills operate, how forests may be used, or who possesses the right to fish particular streams. To outsiders, these regulations might appear excessively complicated. To local residents, however, they formed the rhythm of ordinary existence. Children learned many customs almost without noticing. Parents explained boundaries. Priests reminded congregations of moral expectations. Village courts occasionally settled disagreements before they expanded into lasting conflicts. The goal was often stability rather than punishment, one of the earliest categories of seemingly peculiar medieval laws involved animals. Livestock represented enormous economic value. A wandering pig could destroy valuable crops within minutes. Geese might invade gardens. Cattle crossing property boundaries could create disputes lasting years. Consequently, legal systems devoted surprising attention to creatures that modern city dwellers rarely consider in legal discussions. Certain towns required pigs to wear wooden yokes around their necks. These devices prevented animals from squeezing through narrow fences and entering cultivated fields. Today, the idea may sound amusing. Yet, for farming families surviving from one harvest to the next, preventing crop damage carried life or death significance. A damaged vegetable plot might reduce winter food supplies considerably. Other communities find owners whose geese repeatedly disturbed neighbors. Medieval documents occasionally describe surprisingly detailed testimony concerning wandering birds, damaged grain, or trampled gardens. Witnesses carefully explained exactly where animals had traveled and whose property suffered losses. Judges treated these matters seriously because agricultural productivity supported the entire local economy. Dogs also appeared frequently within medieval regulations. Hunting remained both an aristocratic privilege and an important means of obtaining food in some regions. Forest laws therefore attempted to distinguish between hunting animals and ordinary village dogs. In parts of England, strict forest regulations even required certain dogs living near royal forests to undergo a procedure called lawing, reducing their ability to chase deer. Modern readers often react with disbelief, yet royal hunting grounds represented valuable political and economic resources, protected by extensive legal traditions. These forest laws themselves became legendary for their complexity. Medieval kings regarded many woodlands not simply as collections of trees, but as carefully managed royal reserves. Special officials supervised wildlife. Unauthorized hunting could bring severe penalties, particularly when involving valuable game animals reserved for noble use. Meanwhile, ordinary villagers still depended upon forests for firewood, grazing pigs, gathering berries, collecting mushrooms, and obtaining construction materials. Balancing these competing interests generated an astonishing variety of regulations. Interestingly, many unusual medieval laws were less concerned with individual freedom than with preserving communal survival. Consider bread, the foundation of daily nutrition across much of Europe. Local authorities often inspected loaves to ensure bakers sold honest weights. The famous assize of bread and ale in medieval England established detailed standards linking bread prices to grain costs. Bakers producing undersized loaves faced penalties because dishonest practices threatened public trust during years when harvests already remained uncertain. Modern supermarkets rarely inspire philosophical reflection. Medieval marketplaces certainly did. Every loaf, barrel, measure of grain, and cup of ale carried implications, extending far beyond simple commerce. Fair dealing strengthened community stability. Fraud risked provoking resentment between neighbors already living under difficult conditions. Therefore, regulations concerning food became surprisingly elaborate. Ale deserves particular attention because water quality varied considerably. Fermented beverages often provided safer daily drinks than untreated water sources. Brewing, therefore, represented essential household labor, not merely leisure. Local officials known in England as ale tasters occasionally inspected beverages to maintain standards. Their responsibilities remind us that medieval governments often regulated necessities through locally trusted individuals rather than distant bureaucracies. Another remarkable feature of medieval law involved collective responsibility. In several regions, groups of households shared legal obligations. If someone committed certain offenses and escaped, neighbors sometimes faced pressure to assist authorities. Systems such as frank pledge in England reflected the belief that communities functioned best when residents accepted mutual responsibility for maintaining peace. While unusual from a modern perspective, these arrangements reduced reliance upon centralized enforcement that scarcely existed. Religious observance also shaped legislation in countless ways. Feast days, fasting periods, marriage customs, inheritance practices, and market schedules frequently reflected the liturgical calendar. Church courts addressed matters that today belong to civil institutions. Consequently, everyday legal life intertwined with religious expectations far more closely than most modern societies experience. Occasionally, medieval lawmakers addressed behavior that sounds strangely specific. Certain municipal ordinances prohibited throwing waste into public streets near important buildings. Others regulated chimney construction after destructive urban fires. Some instructed butchers regarding where animals could be slaughtered. Although individually, these regulations seem oddly narrow, together they reveal communities learning through repeated experience. Each rule often emerged because an earlier incident demonstrated the consequences of neglect. Perhaps the greatest misconception about medieval law is the assumption that it always appeared irrational. Certainly, some regulations reflected beliefs modern science rejects. Others enforced social hierarchies that contemporary societies rightly criticize. Nevertheless, many apparently bizarre statutes solved practical problems using the knowledge available at the time. Once historians reconstruct the surrounding circumstances, absurdity frequently transforms into understandable necessity. Still, some legal records remain delightfully puzzling even after careful analysis. Scattered across surviving manuscripts are references to disputes so unusual that researchers continue debating exactly what happened. Why did one ordinance devote remarkable attention to pigeons? Why did another specify precise responsibilities regarding bells, bridges, or beehives? These documents invite curiosity because they preserve tiny glimpses of forgotten daily concerns. The farther we explore medieval legal history, the clearer one truth becomes. People 1,000 years ago worried about familiar things. They wanted secure homes. They hoped for good harvests. They feared theft, fire, disease, and unpredictable weather. They negotiated disagreements with neighbors. They attempted to protect families and livelihoods. Their solutions sometimes appear wonderfully unfamiliar, yet their underlying concerns remain surprisingly recognizable. As our quiet journey continues, we will soon enter towns where clothing itself could become a legal matter, where what someone wore might reveal not only wealth, but legal status, occupation, and social expectations. These remarkable regulations would influence merchants, craftsmen, nobles, and ordinary villagers alike, creating another fascinating chapter in the long history of medieval law. The morning market had only just begun to fill when questions of clothing quietly entered everyday life. A visitor arriving from another kingdom might first notice the colorful fabrics hanging outside merchant stalls, but a local resident would immediately recognize something less obvious. Every cloak, hood, belt, sleeve, and pair of shoes could communicate information long before a single word was spoken. Medieval society relied heavily upon visible signs. Since most people never carried written identification and literacy remained limited, appearance often helped others understand where someone belonged within the community. This was one reason that some of the most unusual medieval laws ever written concerned not crime or violence, but clothing. To modern eyes, deciding what color a person may wear seems like an extraordinary intrusion into private life. Yet many medieval governments believed clothing performed an important public function. It reflected occupation, wealth, religious identity, and social rank. Authorities feared that if everyone dressed however they wished, confusion might spread through markets, courts, and official ceremonies. A merchant could appear like a knight. A prosperous craftsman might imitate a noble household. Servants could present themselves as people of greater influence. These concerns eventually produced an astonishing collection of regulations known today as sumptuary laws. The word itself sounds unfamiliar, but the idea appeared throughout medieval Europe. Kings, princes, city councils, and local governments attempted to regulate luxury. Certain fabrics became restricted. Particular colors required permission or status. Expensive fur might be reserved for the highest ranks of society. Gold embroidery, imported silk, jeweled belts, and decorative buttons occasionally fell under legal supervision. Such rules varied enormously from one place to another. A garment perfectly acceptable in Florence might violate regulations in London or Paris. At first glance, these laws seem motivated entirely by pride or class divisions. Those factors certainly existed. Medieval societies often accepted social hierarchies as natural. However, historians also identify additional reasons behind these regulations. Imported luxury goods consumed enormous amounts of money. Governments worried that wealthy merchants spent excessive fortunes on foreign textiles rather than supporting local industries. Limiting extravagant purchases could, at least in theory, protect domestic production while also reinforcing established social structures. Imagine walking through an Italian city during the late 13th century. The streets echo with the sounds of blacksmiths, weavers, mule drivers, and traders speaking several different languages. Ships arriving from the eastern Mediterranean have delivered silks, spices, dyes, and precious materials unavailable in northern Europe. Merchants proudly display these costly imports. Demand grows rapidly. Soon city officials begin wondering whether unrestricted luxury encourages unhealthy competition among prosperous families. One household purchases embroidered sleeves. Another responds with richer velvet. A third commissions garments decorated with pearls. Before long, clothing itself becomes a public competition. Municipal councils attempted to slow this cycle through legislation. Some laws specified exactly how many decorative jewels could appear upon a dress. Others restricted the length of trailing gowns worn during ceremonies. In certain cities, officials even counted ornamental buttons. Although enforcement varied greatly, surviving court records reveal that authorities occasionally imposed fines upon those who ignored these detailed requirements. Wedding celebrations attracted particular legal attention. Medieval marriages often united influential families, and lavish ceremonies displayed wealth before entire communities. Some governments feared excessive spending during these events. Consequently, regulations sometimes limited the number of guests invited, the amount of food served, or the value of gifts exchanged. Today, these restrictions may seem remarkably specific, yet officials believed they prevented financial ruin caused by social pressure. Families eager to impress neighbors occasionally borrowed beyond their means. Lawmakers hoped moderation would protect both households and broader economic stability. Not everyone accepted these rules quietly. Wealthy merchants frequently possessed incomes rivaling lesser nobles, yet traditional customs denied them equivalent social recognition. Clothing became one visible arena where prosperity challenged inherited privilege. Court documents occasionally describe disputes over garments confiscated or fines contested. Such disagreements remind us that medieval law remained an active conversation between governments, and the people expected to obey them. Colors themselves sometimes carried remarkable significance. Producing brilliant dyes required expensive materials and specialized knowledge. Deep crimson, vibrant blue, and rich purple often cost astonishing sums. Wearing these colors signaled access to considerable resources. In some regions, legal restrictions attempted to preserve their symbolic association with political or religious authority. Although these regulations differed widely across Europe, they reflected a common belief that appearance contributed to public order. The same concern extended beyond cities into rural communities. Village festivals brought together people from surrounding settlements. Clothing immediately distinguished local customs, occupations, and family traditions. Certain guilds required members to wear identifiable garments during religious processions. Brotherhoods adopted distinctive colors. Pilgrims returning from sacred journeys sometimes attached recognizable badges to hats or cloaks. Medieval observers could often learn much simply by watching travelers enter the marketplace. Shoes also attracted legal curiosity. During several periods, fashion favored extremely long pointed shoes, known today by historians as poolings or krakos. Some examples extended far beyond practical necessity. Contemporary illustrations depict elegant footwear with elongated tips bending upward in almost theatrical fashion. Church leaders occasionally criticized these designs as symbols of vanity. Civic authorities sometimes agreed. In a few places, regulations limited exactly how long these pointed shoes might become. Why devote legislation to footwear? Partly because fashion reflected broader cultural values. Excessive ornamentation invited criticism from religious writers advocating humility. Practical concerns also emerged. Extremely long shoes proved awkward upon muddy streets and uneven roads. Knights found them inconvenient beneath armor. Laborers could hardly perform physical work while wearing exaggerated designs. Once again, an apparently humorous regulation often rested upon practical observations. Hats carried equally interesting meanings. In various towns, officials required members of certain professions to wear distinctive head coverings. Physicians, scholars, craftsmen, and religious figures could often be recognized immediately through characteristic styles. These visual distinctions reduced confusion in crowded marketplaces where strangers frequently interacted without written credentials. Clothing, therefore, functioned almost like a medieval identification system, yet perhaps even stranger than clothing regulations were laws governing facial hair. Although styles changed dramatically across centuries, several medieval communities occasionally associated particular beard fashions with social identity or foreign influence. Clergy debated appropriate appearances. Military leaders preferred practical grooming. Noble courts embraced changing fashions, inspired by neighboring kingdoms, while sweeping legal control over beards remained uncommon. Scattered local ordinances demonstrate how seriously appearance could be taken. Textile production itself formed one of medieval Europe's largest industries. Wool from English sheep supplied weaving centers across the continent. Flemish towns developed international reputations for fine cloth. Italian merchants coordinated extensive trade networks connecting European markets with distant regions. Governments, therefore, regulated manufacturing standards with remarkable precision. Cloth inspectors measured widths, examined weaving quality, and verified dye consistency. A dishonest producer could damage an entire city's commercial reputation abroad. Guilds played an essential role within this system. These organizations represented skilled craftsmen, establishing standards for apprenticeships, production methods, and business conduct. Membership often required years of training. Guild regulations occasionally appeared extraordinarily detailed. They specified working hours, approved materials, pricing practices, and acceptable techniques. Modern readers sometimes mistake these rules for government laws, when, in reality, many originated within professional organizations, enforcing their own standards. A young apprentice entering a weaving workshop faced countless expectations, extending beyond technical skill. He learned how to prepare thread, operate looms, identify quality fibers, negotiate fairly with customers, and maintain the workshop's reputation. Violating guild rules could result in fines, temporary suspension, or exclusion from the profession altogether. Economic survival depended upon trust. Buyers returning from distant markets expected consistent quality. Detailed regulations attempted to guarantee exactly that. The marketplace offered countless opportunities for misunderstanding without such standards. Imagine purchasing several yards of expensive cloth only to discover at home that the material measured less than promised. Medieval customers worried about precisely these problems. Officials therefore inspected measuring rods, standardized weights, and occasionally even the methods merchants used while folding fabric. Although these procedures sound painstaking, they reduced opportunities for fraud in bustling commercial centers. Clothing laws also intersected with religious observance. Certain holy periods encouraged modest dress. Monastic communities adopted distinctive habits, symbolizing simplicity and discipline. Pilgrims traveling toward famous shrines often wore recognizable garments, reflecting both practical needs and spiritual commitments. These traditions varied across Europe, yet reinforced the close relationship between appearance and identity. Visitors from the modern world might easily conclude that medieval people devoted excessive attention to external appearances. In truth, visible symbols helped organize societies, lacking many institutions now taken for granted. Uniform police forces scarcely existed. National identity remained limited. Local reputation carried immense importance. Clothing, therefore, communicated information quickly in crowded environments where strangers regularly met. Despite every regulation, fashion continually evolved. Ambitious tailors introduced new cuts. Merchants imported unfamiliar textiles. Nobles admired foreign styles encountered during diplomacy or military campaigns. Young people experimented with trends that older generations criticized. Officials responded by drafting additional laws, many of which survive today in archives scattered across Europe. Reading them creates the curious impression that every generation believed the next dressed far too extravagantly. As evening slowly settled over these medieval towns, another set of remarkable regulations quietly influenced daily routines. Once darkness covered narrow streets and the marketplace emptied, local authorities turned their attention towards something every household depended upon, yet everyone feared: fire. In communities built largely from timber, with roofs of straw or wooden shingles standing shoulder to shoulder, even a single unattended flame could transform an ordinary night into catastrophe. The laws created to prevent those disasters would become some of the most practical and occasionally most surprising regulations of the medieval world. The fear of fire shaped medieval cities more deeply than many modern visitors realize. During daylight, crowded streets buzzed with merchants, craftsmen, carts, and animals. After sunset, however, another reality emerged. Hundreds or even thousands of households relied upon open flames for light, cooking, heating, and workshop labor. Most buildings contained wooden beams. Many roofs used thatch or wooden shingles. Narrow lanes allowed structures to stand almost wall against wall. Under these conditions, a single spark could travel through an entire neighborhood with frightening speed. For that reason, some of the strangest medieval laws focused not on dramatic crimes, but on ordinary evening routines. Town officials understood that disaster often began with something seemingly insignificant: a forgotten candle, a cooking fire left unattended, or hot ashes dumped carelessly beside a wooden fence. Imagine a winter evening in a 14th century English town. The market has closed. Shop shutters are fastened. Smoke drifts from chimneys into the cold air. Inside crowded homes, families gather around hearths while craftsmen finish the last tasks of the day. Somewhere, a blacksmith allows iron to cool. Nearby, a baker prepares dough for the morning. Every glowing ember represents both comfort and danger. Many towns therefore required residents to observe curfews connected directly to fire prevention. The famous word curfew originally referred to the covering or extinguishing of household fires. When the evening bell rang, residents were expected to bank their hearths safely, reduce open flames, and prepare for the night. Modern curfews usually concern movement through streets. Medieval curfews often concerned the management of fire itself. Some regulations specified exactly when workshop furnaces had to be extinguished. Others prohibited certain trades from operating after dark. Bakers, brewers, smiths, and metalworkers frequently used intense heat, making their premises particularly risky. Authorities worried that tired workers might overlook sparks capable of igniting nearby buildings. The penalties could be surprisingly serious. A careless fire threatened not merely one household, but an entire community. Medieval towns lacked modern fire engines, pressurized water systems, and organized emergency services. When flames spread, neighbors formed bucket lines from wells, rivers, or public cisterns. Bells rang through the streets. Everyone who was physically able might be expected to help. This communal responsibility produced another unusual category of laws. In several cities, residents were legally required to keep basic firefighting equipment at home. A household might need buckets, ladders, hooks, or other tools that could be used during emergencies. Officials occasionally inspected whether these items were available and in usable condition. Hooks deserve special attention because they reveal medieval firefighting methods. When a blaze became impossible to control, one strategy involved pulling down nearby buildings before the flames reached them. Long poles with iron hooks allowed crews to tear away roofs or walls, creating a gap that might stop the fire from advancing farther through the town. To modern readers, destroying additional buildings in order to fight a fire sounds drastic. Yet, in densely packed medieval streets, sacrificing one structure could save dozens of others. Local laws, therefore, sometimes authorized officials to order demolition during major emergencies. Cooking created its own legal challenges. Many urban houses contained only limited space, and open hearths produced constant sparks. Some towns prohibited frying certain foods near highly flammable materials. Others regulated where commercial kitchens could operate. Records from various European cities show repeated concern about ovens, chimneys, and the storage of fuel. Chimneys themselves became subjects of legislation. Early medieval buildings often vented smoke through simple openings in the roof. As towns grew larger, authorities increasingly encouraged or required more secure chimney construction. Poorly built chimneys could crack, leak sparks, or collapse onto neighboring properties. One surviving ordinance from a continental city devoted remarkable detail to the thickness of chimney walls and the distance between hearths and wooden beams. Reading such regulations today can feel surprisingly modern. Beneath the archaic language lies a familiar goal: preventing accidents before they happen. Night watchmen formed another important part of urban safety. Many towns employed guards who patrolled streets after dark, listening for trouble and watching for signs of fire. Their duties extended beyond crime prevention. A watchman who smelled smoke or saw unusual light beneath a roof might raise the alarm before a small incident became a catastrophe. These patrols generated yet more unusual rules. Residents were sometimes required to answer when challenged by the watch. Carrying open torches through certain areas could be restricted. In some places, people moving about late at night needed a legitimate reason for being outside. The combination of darkness, fire risk, and limited visibility made medieval authorities cautious about nighttime activity. Streets lacked electric lighting. Even moonlit evenings could leave alleys and courtyards in deep shadow. Officials preferred predictable routines that reduced opportunities for both accidents and disorder. Fires that did occur often left powerful impressions on contemporaries. Chroniclers described flames leaping across rooftops, church bells ringing continuously, and entire districts disappearing before dawn. Because rebuilding required enormous labor and expense, communities remembered major fires for generations. London experienced several destructive fires long before the famous Great Fire of 1666. Paris, Lubeck, Florence, and countless smaller towns faced similar disasters. Each catastrophe encouraged new regulations, stricter inspections, or revised building standards. Sometimes lawmakers responded with rules that appear oddly specific. One ordinance prohibited storing large quantities of straw beneath upper floors. Another restricted the location of pitch and tar, both highly flammable materials. A third required bakers to maintain particular distances between ovens and neighboring walls. These details may seem excessive until one remembers how closely medieval buildings stood together. A spark escaping from a bakery could reach a carpenter's workshop. From there, the fire might spread to homes, warehouses, and market stalls within minutes. Even candles attracted legal attention. Wealthier households used wax candles, while many ordinary families relied on cheaper tallow candles made from animal fat. Tallow produced more smoke and could burn unevenly. Some institutions established rules about where candles might be placed, especially in storage rooms filled with cloth, parchment, or grain. Monasteries preserved particularly detailed fire regulations. Their libraries contained priceless manuscripts, and a single accident could destroy centuries of work. Monastic rules often instructed brothers to monitor lamps carefully, inspect hearths before sleep, and keep water available in vulnerable areas. The concern extended to public celebrations as well. Medieval festivals frequently involved torches, bonfires, and processions. Authorities sometimes limited where these events could occur, especially during dry weather. A joyful celebration could become dangerous if flames reached nearby roofs. One especially interesting regulation from a northern European town required brewers to report unusually large fuel deliveries. Officials worried that excessive wood or charcoal stored in crowded neighborhoods increased fire hazards. What appears to be an obscure bureaucratic rule was actually an early attempt at risk management. The same practical mindset shaped building materials. Stone construction became increasingly desirable in many prosperous cities because it resisted fire better than timber. After major blazes, governments occasionally ordered certain streets to be rebuilt with with masonry walls or tile roofs. Compliance could be expensive, leading to disputes between property owners and officials. Medieval law, therefore, reveals a constant negotiation between safety and affordability. Everyone wanted protection from fire. Not everyone could easily pay for safer construction. Authorities balanced ideal standards against economic reality, much as modern cities still do when updating building codes. Perhaps the most surprising lesson is how recognizable many of these concerns remain. Modern smoke detectors, fire inspections, occupancy limits, and emergency exits all reflect the same basic principle that medieval lawmakers understood very well. Preventing catastrophe is usually easier than stopping it once it begins. Yet despite all these precautions, medieval governments also worried about another threat that spread through communities in a very different way. Fire raced through streets in hours. Disease moved more slowly, often invisibly, crossing city gates with travelers, merchants, and ships arriving from distant ports. The laws created to control those dangers would become some of the most unusual and occasionally most revealing regulations of the late medieval world. Long before physicians understood bacteria or viruses, medieval communities recognized a simple but unsettling truth. Illness could arrive without warning, spread from household to household, and alter the rhythm of an entire town within days or weeks. People did not know precisely why epidemics occurred, yet they carefully observed patterns. They noticed that sickness sometimes followed the arrival of unfamiliar travelers. They saw entire families become ill after visiting the same neighborhood. They remembered years when crowded markets were followed by widespread disease. Those observations, although incomplete, gradually inspired a remarkable collection of laws that attempted to protect communities using the knowledge available at the time. To a modern reader, some of these regulations appear surprisingly sensible. Others seem deeply strange. Together, however, they reveal how medieval lawmakers tried to impose order upon events that often felt beyond human control. Imagine approaching the gates of a prosperous trading city during the late 14th century. Long before the towers become clearly visible, the road grows busy, with merchants guiding wagons, monks traveling between monasteries, pilgrims carrying small bundles, fishermen bringing barrels of salted catch, and farmers hopping to sell vegetables before sunset. Every newcomer represents opportunity. Every newcomer also carries uncertainty. Trade enriched medieval Europe. Ships crossed the Mediterranean loaded with spices, cloth, glass, timber, grain, and precious metals. Riverboats linked inland towns. Pack horses climbed mountain passes, connecting distant kingdoms. Yet, every successful commercial network also allowed disease to travel farther than ever before. When devastating epidemics struck Europe during the 14th century, authorities responded with experiments that eventually transformed public health. Many of those responses began as temporary emergency measures before gradually becoming permanent legal traditions. One of the most famous examples emerged in the great maritime cities. Officials noticed that arriving ships occasionally brought illness into crowded ports. Rather than immediately unloading passengers and cargo, some governments required vessels to remain isolated before entering the harbor. This practice eventually became known as quarantine, a word connected to the Italian practice of requiring 40 days of isolation under certain circumstances. 40 days may seem like an oddly specific number. Historians believe the choice reflected both practical observation and religious symbolism. The number appeared repeatedly in biblical tradition, while longer waiting periods also allowed authorities additional time to observe whether sickness developed among travelers. Standing upon a harbor wall, a resident might watch unfamiliar ships anchored quietly offshore, their sails lowered, their crews waiting patiently for permission to land. Supplies could be delivered under careful supervision. Officials might inspect passengers from a distance before deciding whether entry posed too great a risk. Modern science explains infectious disease far differently than medieval physicians could. Nevertheless, the underlying principle behind quarantine proved remarkably effective in certain situations. Limiting contact slowed transmission, even if contemporaries misunderstood the precise biological reasons. Not every city adopted identical measures. Local governments experimented constantly. Some required health certificates from arriving merchants. Others appointed inspectors responsible for monitoring travelers. Certain towns established temporary isolation houses outside defensive walls. Each community adjusted its rules according to local experience, geography, and available resources. These efforts extended beyond travelers. Markets themselves became subjects of legal attention. Medieval marketplaces attracted enormous crowds where strangers exchanged goods, stories, and news from across Europe. During periods of unusual illness, officials occasionally restricted market days, relocated trading activities, or temporarily closed sections of the town. Such decisions carried serious economic consequences. Farmers depended upon regular markets to sell produce. Craftsmen relied upon visiting customers. Merchants earned livelihoods through constant movement between cities. Closing commercial activity protected health but threatened income. Medieval leaders faced difficult choices remarkably similar to those confronting governments during modern epidemics. Another unusual category of regulations concerned waste disposal. Medieval sanitation varied enormously from one place to another. Some towns maintained impressive drainage systems and public cleaning schedules. Others struggled with overcrowding and limited infrastructure. Authorities increasingly realized that foul-smelling refuse created unhealthy environments. even though they misunderstood the exact relationship between sanitation and disease. Consequently, city councils drafted surprisingly detailed laws governing where waste could be discarded. Throwing rubbish into busy streets often attracted fines. Dumping animal remains near wells became prohibited in many communities. Butchers received instructions regarding disposal methods. Tanners working with animal hides frequently operated outside populated districts because their work produced strong odors and large amounts of waste. Reading these ordinances today reveals an interesting mixture of practical wisdom and mistaken assumptions. Medieval people often believed dangerous air, known as miasma, contributed to illness. Although this theory failed to identify microbes, efforts to keep streets cleaner nevertheless improved public conditions in many places. Public wells occupied a particularly important position within these regulations. Clean water determined the survival of every household. Authorities therefore monitored activities near wells with unusual care. Washing animals, disposing of waste, or conducting certain trades nearby could violate local ordinances. Protecting shared water sources became one of the earliest forms of organized public health. Hospitals also operated under distinctive legal traditions. Medieval hospitals differed greatly from modern medical centers. Many functioned as charitable institutions, offering shelter, food, and basic care to travelers, the elderly, the poor, and the sick. Religious communities frequently managed these establishments, combining practical assistance with spiritual support. Admission sometimes followed carefully defined rules. Separate spaces might be maintained for different categories of residents. Visitors occasionally faced restrictions during outbreaks of illness. Although medical knowledge remained limited, administrators recognized that uncontrolled movement increased risks within crowded buildings. Leprosy inspired another set of unusual laws. Medieval Europeans feared the disease intensely, partly because its symptoms could be dramatic, and because its causes remained mysterious. Communities often established specialized hospitals or settlements outside town walls where those diagnosed with leprosy lived separately from the general population. Modern historians emphasize that the reality was more complex than older popular stories suggest. Not everyone with skin diseases actually suffered from leprosy. Diagnosis could be difficult, and treatment varied considerably across regions. Nevertheless, surviving legal records demonstrate how deeply communities attempted to balance compassion, fear, charity, and public safety. Some towns required individuals believed to have leprosy to carry distinctive clothing or small bells while traveling. Modern readers often view such measures as cruel, and indeed, they could create painful social isolation. Yet, medieval authorities generally believed these practices reduced uncertainty while allowing affected individuals to receive organized support through designated institutions. medical practitioners themselves occasionally came under legal supervision. Physicians, surgeons, barber surgeons, and apothecaries occupied different roles within medieval healthcare. Cities increasingly sought ways to distinguish experienced practitioners from frauds promising miraculous cures. Certain universities became authorized to train physicians formally. Municipal governments occasionally required proof of competence before allowing someone to practice medicine within city walls. Although these systems remained inconsistent, they represented early attempts to regulate professional standards. Apothecaries faced equally detailed expectations. Herbs, minerals, oils, honey, wine, and imported spices formed ingredients for countless remedies. Authorities occasionally inspected inventories or standardized measurements to reduce deception. A dishonest apothecary selling inferior ingredients endangered both reputation and public confidence. One particularly curious regulation concerned burial practices during major epidemics. Ordinary funeral customs sometimes became impossible when deaths increased rapidly. Temporary rules governed where burials occurred, how quickly they took place, and who supervised the process. These measures reflected both practical necessity and profound respect for religious traditions surrounding death. Churches worked closely with civic authorities during such crises. Bells announced prayers as well as public notices. Clergy comforted grieving families, while officials organized practical responses. Medieval society rarely separated religious and civic life into completely distinct spheres. Both institutions contributed to maintaining community stability. Animals again appeared unexpectedly within legal discussions. Stray pigs wandering through crowded streets presented sanitation concerns. Dogs sometimes attracted suspicion during epidemics because frightened populations searched desperately for explanations. Historians caution that many such beliefs lacked scientific foundation, yet they occasionally influenced local regulations. Perhaps the most revealing aspect of medieval public health law is its emphasis upon observation. Without microscopes or laboratory testing, communities relied upon visible patterns. Officials asked practical questions. Which neighborhoods reported illness first? Did cases increase after particular events? Which occupations appeared especially vulnerable? Although their conclusions were not always accurate, their willingness to observe carefully laid important foundations for future developments. Travelers frequently encountered these changing regulations firsthand. A merchant who entered one city without difficulty might discover stricter inspections only a week's journey away. Political borders mattered less than local conditions. Each council adjusted policies according to immediate circumstances. These experiences reminded medieval people that law was rarely fixed forever. Extraordinary events often produced extraordinary legislation. Some emergency measures disappeared once danger passed. Others remained for generations because communities concluded they provided lasting benefits. Looking back across these centuries, it becomes easier to appreciate how ordinary people navigated uncertainty with limited knowledge but considerable determination. They lacked modern medicine. They possessed no understanding of microbes. Yet they organized inspections, improved sanitation, regulated travel, and experimented with preventive measures that occasionally achieved genuine success. As our quiet journey continues, we will leave behind the crowded streets and busy ports to explore another corner of medieval legal life, where the rules become even more unexpected. Deep within forests, across rivers, and along the boundaries separating one estate from another, the law sometimes protected creatures, trees, ponds, and even seemingly ordinary patches of land with astonishing seriousness. What happened there could determine whether a traveler paid a fine, lost valuable property, or found themselves answering before a lord's court for an act that today might seem almost impossible to imagine. The deeper one travels into medieval Europe, the quieter the landscape often becomes. Bustling market squares slowly disappear behind winding roads. Stone churches grow farther apart. Villages become smaller. Thick forests stretch across hillsides, broken only by narrow streams, wooden bridges, and occasional clearings where generations of families have patiently cultivated the land. To many modern visitors, these woodlands might appear open and inviting, ideal places for gathering firewood or wandering wherever curiosity leads. Medieval people, however, often saw something entirely different. A forest was not simply a collection of trees. It was a carefully regulated landscape governed by some of the most unusual laws ever written. Today, the word forest usually describes a natural environment. During much of the Middle Ages, particularly in England after the Norman conquest, a royal forest referred to a legal designation rather than a geographical one. Surprisingly, many royal forests contained villages, farmland, churches, and cultivated fields. What made them special was not their appearance, but the legal system that governed them. This distinction confused travelers then just as it confuses readers now. Imagine spending an entire day walking through peaceful countryside. Farmers harvest grain beside the road. Children chase chickens through village lanes. Sheep graze quietly on distant hills. Nothing seems particularly unusual. Then, without crossing any obvious boundary, you enter land protected under forest law. The trees have not changed. The birds sound the same. Yet the rules governing your behavior have become dramatically different. Forest law existed primarily to protect royal hunting grounds and valuable resources. Deer, wild boar, and other game represented more than food. They symbolized royal authority, political privilege, and aristocratic identity. Hunting certain animals without permission could therefore become a legal matter far more serious than a modern reader might expect. To outsiders, these regulations often seemed astonishingly strict. One unusual aspect involved the distinction between protecting the animals themselves and protecting the places where those animals lived. Medieval legal texts sometimes referred separately to the vert and the venison. Vert meant the vegetation that sustained wildlife, while venison referred not merely to meat, but to the protected game animals themselves. Damaging either could violate forest law. This meant that cutting branches, clearing woodland, or even disturbing undergrowth occasionally attracted official attention, because such actions altered the habitat supporting royal game. Modern conservationists may notice something unexpectedly familiar here. Although medieval rulers pursued these policies primarily for hunting rather than environmental preservation, the laws nevertheless recognized an important ecological relationship. Healthy wildlife depended upon healthy landscapes. Of course, ordinary villagers also depended upon forests. Families gathered fallen branches for fuel. Swineherds drove pigs beneath oak trees during autumn so they could feed upon fallen acorns, a practice known as pannage. Women collected berries, herbs, mushrooms, and medicinal plants. Beekeepers searched for wild honey. Carpenters required timber. Wheelwrights needed suitable wood for wagons. Every household relied upon forest resources in countless ways. Balancing these competing interests proved extraordinarily complicated. Rather than banning all activity, many forests operated through carefully regulated rights. Certain families possessed ancient permission to graze animals. Others could gather dead wood but not cut living trees. Some villages enjoyed fishing rights in particular streams, while neighboring settlements did not. These customs often stretched back generations, preserved through local memory as much as written documentation. Disagreements naturally followed. Suppose two neighboring villages both believed they possessed grazing rights within the same woodland. Neither community wished to surrender valuable pasture. Witnesses might appear before local courts, recalling what grandparents had practiced decades earlier. Elderly residents became valuable sources of evidence because they remembered boundaries established long before surviving documents. Boundary disputes produced some remarkably unusual legal ceremonies. Instead of relying solely upon maps, medieval communities sometimes organized processions during which residents physically walked the borders of their lands. Children occasionally participated, so they would remember important landmarks throughout their lives. At particularly significant points, traditions developed that modern readers may find rather surprising. In parts of England, boys were sometimes gently bumped or tapped against boundary stones or distinctive trees. The intention was not punishment, but memory. Experiencing the location physically made it less likely they would forget the exact position years later. Before detailed surveying equipment became common, living memory represented one of the most reliable methods for preserving local geography. These annual walks became known in later centuries as beating the bounds, a tradition that survived long after many medieval legal systems disappeared. Trees themselves occasionally received extraordinary legal attention. Certain ancient oaks marked estate boundaries for centuries. Others served as recognized meeting places where local courts assembled beneath their branches. Destroying such a tree could erase an important legal landmark. Consequently, some communities imposed penalties for damaging particular specimens, whose significance extended far beyond their timber value. Not every tree enjoyed such protection, however. Wood represented one of medieval Europe's most essential resources. Homes, bridges, carts, ships, furniture, barrels, tools, mills, and defensive structures all required enormous quantities of timber. Governments therefore attempted to regulate harvesting carefully. Unauthorized cutting sometimes resulted in fines reflecting not only the value of the wood removed, but also the long-term importance of maintaining sufficient forest supplies. One especially curious category of regulation concerned beehives. Wild honey remained an important sweetener before sugar became widely available in Europe. Beeswax also held enormous value because churches preferred wax candles for religious ceremonies. As a result, ownership of bee trees, hollow trees containing wild colonies, occasionally became a legal matter. Imagine discovering such a tree while gathering firewood. Could you claim it? Did it belong to the landowner? Did local custom grant rights to whoever first identified the hive? Different regions answered these questions differently, producing a fascinating variety of legal traditions. Fish generated similar complexity. Rivers crossing medieval estates rarely functioned as unrestricted public spaces. Fishing rights often belonged to particular lords, monasteries, villages, or towns. Certain stretches of water supported expensive fish ponds, carefully managed to provide food during religious fasting periods when meat consumption declined. Fish ponds themselves represented remarkable engineering achievements. Monastic communities especially invested considerable effort constructing ponds connected by channels controlling water flow. Carp, pike, tench, and other species could be raised systematically, ensuring reliable supplies throughout the year. Because these systems required substantial labor, governments protected them through detailed legal regulations. Stealing fish from a managed pond might appear trivial today. In the Middle Ages, it could threaten an institution's carefully planned food supply. Watermills received equally careful protection. The steady turning of a mill wheel transformed grain into flour, supporting entire communities. Constructing a mill demanded engineering skill, investment, and access to flowing water. Lords frequently possessed legal rights, requiring local tenants to grind grain at designated mills rather than building competing facilities. Modern economists sometimes describe these arrangements as monopolies, though medieval participants viewed them differently. The lord maintained expensive infrastructure. Tenants received dependable milling services. Payments helped finance repairs and operation. Whether the arrangement always felt fair depended greatly upon whom one asked. Disputes over rivers extended beyond fishing and mills. If someone diverted a stream to irrigate fields, downstream neighbors might suddenly lose water essential for livestock or milling. Local courts heard numerous cases concerning dams, channels, and bridges. Even relatively small alterations could influence entire communities. Bridges occupied a particularly interesting legal position. Crossing a river safely transformed trade, travel, and communication. Maintaining bridges required continuous labor because floods, ice, and heavy wagons gradually weakened wooden structures. Some medieval laws assigned nearby villages responsibility for repairs. Others collected tolls from travelers to finance maintenance. Failure to repair a bridge occasionally resulted in penalties because neglected infrastructure affected everyone. One surviving legal record describes a prolonged disagreement over responsibility for replacing damaged planks after seasonal flooding. At first glance, the dispute appears mundane. Yet, merchants could not transport goods efficiently. Pilgrims faced dangerous crossings, and neighboring settlements became partially isolated until repairs were completed. Perhaps the strangest forest regulations involved wolves. Although wolves gradually disappeared from much of Western Europe, they remained important predators during earlier medieval centuries. Some rulers offered rewards for killing wolves threatening livestock. Elsewhere, hunting rights remained carefully controlled. Local circumstances determined policy far more than universal principles. The same flexibility characterized medieval law generally. Contrary to popular imagination, there was rarely one single rule applying everywhere. Customs evolved locally. Geography mattered. Climate mattered. Economic needs mattered. A mountain community developed different priorities than a river port. Coastal towns differed from inland farming villages. The law reflected those differences. As centuries passed, expanding populations slowly transformed many forests into farmland. New villages appeared. Roads improved. Commercial activity increased. Yet the older legal traditions often remained embedded beneath these changing landscapes, preserving memories of a time when woodland resources required exceptionally careful management. To modern readers, regulations concerning acorns, beehives, boundary stones, or ancient oak trees may seem delightfully peculiar. To medieval communities, however, these laws protected the foundations of everyday survival. They governed fuel, food, construction materials, transportation, and agriculture resources upon which every household depended. Soon, our journey will leave the forests behind and enter another world where the law became unexpectedly personal. Inside medieval households, around family tables, and within the ceremonies marking birth, marriage, and inheritance, legal customs reached into nearly every stage of life. Some of those rules would prove even stranger than anything found beneath the forest canopy, revealing just how closely medieval law followed people from the day they were born until long after they were gone. The law did not remain outside the front door. It followed medieval families into kitchens warmed by smoky hearths, into barns where the day's work ended, into churches where marriages were blessed, and into the quiet moments when parents wondered what kind of future awaited their children. Modern legal systems often separate family life from government in many ways, but medieval society rarely drew such clear boundaries. Birth, marriage, inheritance, adoption, guardianship, and even the placement of a dining table could become matters shaped by custom, local authority, or written law. Some of these regulations appear entirely reasonable. Others seem so unusual that they almost sound like scenes from folklore. Yet, each one reflected real concerns about property, responsibility, and survival. Imagine entering a prosperous village shortly before sunset. Smoke rises gently from dozens of cottages. Children help gather firewood before darkness falls. Women prepare evening meals, while men return from fields carrying tools worn smooth by years of use. Chickens wander freely between houses. Dogs lie beside doorways. Everything appears peaceful. Beneath this ordinary scene, however, lies an invisible network of legal obligations, connecting nearly every family to their neighbors, their lord, and the church. Marriage stood at the center of many of these obligations. Today, many people think of marriage primarily as a personal relationship. During much of the Middle Ages, it also carried enormous legal and economic significance. Marriage determined inheritance, property ownership, alliances between families, and the future of farmland carefully cultivated across generations. Because land represented wealth, food, and security, choosing a marriage partner often involved far more than affection alone. One surprisingly unusual medieval custom concerned the public announcement of marriages. Rather than allowing secret ceremonies, many churches required the publication of marriage bans. On several consecutive Sundays, the priest announced the names of the couple before the congregation, inviting anyone with a legitimate legal objection to come forward. At first, this practice may seem strangely public, yet imagine a small village where nearly everyone knows one another. Suppose someone attempting to marry was already legally married elsewhere. Perhaps the couple were closely related by blood without realizing it. Maybe one person had previously taken religious vows that prohibited marriage. Public announcements allowed such problems to be discovered before rather than after the ceremony. The system depended entirely upon community memory, without national databases or official identification documents. Neighbors themselves often possessed the most reliable information about family histories. Marriage contracts occasionally contained equally fascinating details. In parts of Europe, agreements carefully listed household goods accompanying the bride. Beds, blankets, cooking pots, livestock, furniture, clothing, spinning wheels, and even wooden chests appeared in remarkable detail. These inventories protected property rights should disputes arise later. Reading surviving documents can feel surprisingly intimate. A legal record may calmly note 1 feather mattress, 2 wool blankets, 3 copper cooking vessels, a chest bound with iron, and 6 hens. Each item reminds us that medieval households accumulated possessions gradually over lifetimes of patient work. Inheritance laws, perhaps, generated even greater complexity. Suppose a farmer owned 30 acres divided among several scattered fields. He also possessed a cottage, a small orchard, 2 oxen, a horse, several pigs, and farming tools carefully maintained for decades. Upon his death, who inherited these resources? The answer depended entirely upon local custom. In some regions, the eldest son inherited nearly everything. Elsewhere, property might be divided among several children. Certain towns recognized daughters' inheritance rights under specific circumstances. Widows often retained legally protected interests in portions of family property, though the exact arrangements differed enormously from place to place. One particularly interesting custom involved the widow's dower. This legal provision granted a widow the right to receive support from her husband's estate after his death. The purpose was practical rather than sentimental. Without such protection, many women would have faced immediate poverty despite years spent contributing to the household economy. Different legal traditions calculated these rights differently. Some allocated 1/3 of certain lands. Others relied upon locally established agreements. Court records demonstrate that widows frequently defended these rights with remarkable determination. Children, too, occupied carefully defined legal positions. Medieval society recognized that minors required guardians when parents died unexpectedly. Guardianship laws attempted to ensure both the child's welfare and the preservation of inherited property until adulthood. Not every guardian fulfilled these responsibilities honestly. Occasionally, surviving court cases describe accusations that guardians mismanaged farmland, sold valuable livestock, or neglected buildings entrusted to their care. Judges faced the difficult task of protecting young heirs while balancing competing claims from extended family members. Age itself sometimes carried unexpected legal significance. Modern societies often establish a single age marking adulthood. Medieval communities frequently recognized different ages for different responsibilities. A young person might begin apprenticeship at one age, inherit property at another, perform military service later still, and marry according to separate legal expectations. These overlapping categories reflected practical experience rather than strict numerical rules. Capability mattered as much as birthdays. Apprenticeship produced another remarkable set of legal customs. Imagine a 12-year-old boy leaving his parents' cottage to begin training with a blacksmith in a nearby town. For years, he would live within the master's household, learning every aspect of the trade. The relationship extended beyond simple employment. Masters often accepted responsibilities resembling those of parents, while apprentices promised loyalty, obedience, and diligent work. Formal contracts sometimes specified astonishing details. They prohibited gambling, excessive drinking, marriage during the apprenticeship, leaving without permission, damaging tools, revealing professional secrets. Modern employment contracts rarely regulate personal life so extensively. Yet, medieval apprenticeships aimed to shape character as well as technical skill. Daughters also contributed enormously to household economies. They spun wool into thread, brewed ale, baked bread, tended gardens, cared for younger children, milked livestock, and assisted during harvests. Although surviving legal records often emphasize property held by men, historians increasingly recognize the central economic importance of women's labor throughout medieval society. Household servants occupied another legally interesting position. Contrary to popular stereotypes, not every servant remained permanently poor or powerless. Many young people entered service temporarily before establishing independent households. Contracts frequently determined wages, clothing allowances, food, lodging, and the duration of employment. Some agreements even specified how many pairs of shoes an employer must provide each year. Such details may appear almost humorous until one remembers how expensive handmade footwear could be. Replacing worn shoes represented a meaningful financial obligation. Family disputes inevitably reached local courts. Arguments over borrowed tools, damaged fences, escaped livestock, shared wells, inheritance boundaries, dowry payments, broken promises, rather than dramatic criminal trials. Medieval courts often spent much of their time resolving precisely these ordinary disagreements. Their records offer historians extraordinary glimpses into everyday life. One document may describe neighbors arguing about an apple tree whose branches extended across a boundary. Another concerns chickens repeatedly wandering into vegetable gardens. A third debates responsibility for repairing a shared hedge separating two fields. These cases remind us that medieval justice addressed countless small problems long before they developed into larger conflicts. Hospitality itself occasionally carried legal expectations. Travel remained slow and sometimes dangerous. Pilgrims, merchants, messengers, and craftsmen frequently required overnight lodging. Inns operated under various local regulations concerning prices, safety, and responsibility for guests' belongings. If valuable goods disappeared during the night, determining liability could become surprisingly complicated. Certain towns held innkeepers responsible under specific circumstances. Others distinguished between theft committed by outsiders and negligence within the establishment. Again, local custom shaped legal outcomes. Even household bread ovens generated disputes. Building a private oven required resources unavailable to every family. Some villages shared communal ovens maintained collectively or controlled by local lords. Residents paid small fees for their use. Unauthorized private baking occasionally violated manorial customs, protecting these communal arrangements. To modern readers, regulating where bread may be baked seems extraordinarily intrusive. To medieval villagers, however, communal ovens reduced fire risks, concentrated expensive construction, and provided reliable access for households unable to build their own. Perhaps one of the most curious legal traditions involved household noise. Church bells regulated daily rhythms. Blacksmiths worked from dawn. Dogs barked. Roosters crowed. Markets echoed with conversation. Complete silence simply did not exist. Nevertheless, excessive disturbance occasionally reached local courts. Particularly disruptive behavior during nighttime hours could provoke complaints from neighbors whose livelihoods depended upon rising before sunrise. As communities grew larger, balancing individual freedom against collective comfort became increasingly important. The medieval household therefore existed within an intricate web of expectations, extending far beyond family relationships alone. Neighbors observed one another. Priests announced important events. Guilds supervised trades. Manorial courts settled disputes. Church courts addressed marriages. Royal officials occasionally intervened in matters affecting broader political interests. Every institution overlapped with the others. From a modern perspective, this network may seem surprisingly complex, yet for medieval people, it simply formed the structure of ordinary life. Children grew up learning customs almost unconsciously. Parents explained responsibilities inherited from previous generations. Grandparents remembered older practices no longer written anywhere, but preserved through memory. Law, in many respects, became another family tradition. As the years passed, however, even the most carefully ordered households occasionally found themselves confronting something that no amount of preparation could entirely prevent: human conflict. Not the grand battles celebrated in epic chronicles, but the everyday arguments, insults, misunderstandings, wagers, and neighborhood quarrels that filled local courts with cases both serious and strangely amusing. There, among ordinary villagers standing before equally ordinary judges, some of the most peculiar medieval laws of all would reveal themselves. Disagreements have accompanied human communities for as long as people have lived beside one another. Medieval villages were no exception. Despite the peaceful image often painted by illuminated manuscripts showing farmers harvesting wheat beneath bright summer skies, daily life brought countless opportunities for friction. A wandering cow might trample a neighbor's vegetables. A merchant could accuse another trader of using dishonest weights. Two families might disagree over the precise location of a boundary ditch that had existed for generations. Children occasionally fought. Dogs barked throughout the night. Geese wandered wherever they pleased with remarkable confidence. Most of these incidents never became dramatic stories, yet together they filled the records of medieval courts and produced some of the strangest legal customs historians have ever encountered. Imagine arriving early on the morning of a manorial court session. The village still feels quiet. Mist hangs over nearby fields while the first rays of sunlight illuminate the church tower. Farmers leave their plows for a few hours. Craftsmen close workshops temporarily, and neighbors slowly gather beneath a large timber hall or beneath an ancient tree traditionally used for public meetings. No one expects a spectacular trial involving famous nobles. Instead, the court will spend much of the day listening patiently to ordinary people describing remarkably ordinary problems. One of the first cases concerns a fence. A wooden boundary separating two gardens collapsed during heavy rain several weeks earlier. Since then, chickens from one household have repeatedly crossed into the neighboring plot, scratching newly planted vegetables. The owner of the damaged garden insists the fence belonged to the other family and should have been repaired immediately. The neighboring household replies that the fence stood exactly upon the boundary, and therefore maintenance should have been shared equally. Modern readers may smile at the simplicity of such a disagreement, yet medieval judges understood something important. If small conflicts remained unresolved, resentment could quietly grow for years, eventually damaging relationships essential for the survival of the entire community. Court sessions therefore emphasized restoration as much as punishment. Witnesses described events carefully. Neighbors contributed memories. Elders recalled older customs. After hearing both sides, officials often sought practical solutions, allowing everyone to return peacefully to ordinary life. This approach explains why surviving medieval court rolls contain far more disputes about livestock, property, and unpaid debts than sensational criminal cases. Livestock generated an astonishing number of legal questions. Pigs escaped surprisingly often. Cattle wandered through open gates. Sheep crossed poorly maintained hedges. Goats displayed remarkable determination whenever they discovered gardens containing fresh vegetables, because animals represented valuable investments. Owners rarely abandoned them. Instead, medieval communities developed detailed procedures governing stray livestock. Suppose you discovered an unfamiliar cow grazing peacefully in your meadow. Could you keep it? Certainly not. Could you immediately drive it away? Perhaps. Should you report the discovery? Almost certainly. Many communities required stray animals to be taken into official custody until their owners could be identified. During this period, the owner often paid reasonable expenses associated with feeding and caring for the animal before reclaiming it. Such procedures protected both property rights and neighborhood harmony. Another surprisingly common dispute involved bees. Imagine maintaining several carefully constructed hives beside an orchard throughout spring and summer. One warm afternoon, a swarm suddenly leaves, rising into the sky before settling inside the hollow trunk of a nearby tree located on someone else's land. Who now owns the bees? The answer varied according to local custom. Some legal traditions held that ownership continued only if the beekeeper actively pursued the swarm without interruption. Others emphasized the rights of the landowner once the bees settled permanently. Cases involving escaped bees occasionally reached medieval courts, demonstrating once again that almost any aspect of rural life could acquire legal significance. Trees themselves frequently inspired disagreement. Fruit trees often stood near property boundaries, their branches extending naturally across neighboring land. If apples hanging from an overhanging branch fell into the next garden, who owned them? The tree owner, the landowner where the fruit landed, or whoever collected the apples first. Different regions answered differently. Legal customs evolved gradually through local experience rather than universal agreement. Some judges focused upon ownership of the tree. Others emphasized possession of the land beneath it. These seemingly minor questions mattered because fruit represented valuable food capable of being stored through winter. Even birds occasionally entered legal discussions. Doves, pigeons, and geese wandered freely across medieval landscapes. Certain towns regulated communal dovecotes because large flocks consumed significant quantities of grain. Noble estates sometimes maintained extensive pigeon houses, supplying meat, eggs, and fertilizer. Nearby farmers occasionally complained that these birds damaged crops before harvest. Balancing aristocratic privileges against agricultural losses proved remarkably difficult. Court records preserve numerous examples of such disagreements. Perhaps even more unusual were disputes involving noise. Without engines, aircraft, or modern machinery, medieval villages remained quieter than contemporary cities in many respects. Yet complete silence never existed. Blacksmiths hammered iron. Mill wheels creaked beside rivers. Dogs barked. Church bells rang throughout the day. Roosters announced dawn with unwavering confidence. Market traders called to customers. Most sounds blended naturally into daily life. Occasionally, however, neighbors argued that particular activities exceeded acceptable limits. A blacksmith operating unusually late into the evening might disturb nearby households. An inn hosting noisy celebrations could provoke repeated complaints. Musicians performing outside ordinary festival periods sometimes attracted unwanted attention. Rather than establishing universal noise limits, local authorities usually relied upon community expectations. What counted as excessive in one village might appear entirely normal in another. Public insults represented another fascinating legal category. Medieval society valued personal reputation enormously. Most people spent their entire lives within relatively small communities where everyone knew one another. False accusations could therefore cause lasting harm. Calling someone a thief, a liar, or a dishonest merchant without evidence occasionally resulted in legal action. Interestingly, courts often cared less about wounded feelings than about maintaining social stability. Public quarrels encouraged division. Reconciliation encouraged cooperation. Some judgments required offenders to issue formal apologies before assembled neighbors. Others imposed modest fines payable to local authorities. The objective remained restoring peace rather than humiliating participants. Markets generated particularly colorful legal disputes. Weights and measures occupied central importance. Suppose a merchant sold cloth using a measuring rod shortened by only a few centimeters. Individual customers might lose very little. Across hundreds of transactions, however, the merchant could accumulate considerable dishonest profit. Authorities therefore inspected measuring equipment regularly. Standard weights often remained under official supervision. Millers faced similar scrutiny. Entire communities depended upon fair milling practices. A dishonest miller secretly retaining excessive flour during grinding quickly acquired a poor reputation. Court rolls contain numerous accusations against millers, though historians caution that many reflected popular suspicion rather than proven misconduct. The occupation itself placed millers in positions where misunderstandings easily arose. One especially curious custom involved pledges. When two parties disagreed about debts or promises, they occasionally deposited valuable objects as temporary security while awaiting judgment. A silver cup, a horse, a cloak, even farming tools. These pledges encouraged both sides to return for the court's final decision, rather than disappearing unexpectedly. Failure to appear could result in forfeiture of the deposited item. Games and wagers occasionally attracted legal attention as well. Medieval communities enjoyed festivals, competitions, and friendly contests. Authorities generally tolerated recreation, provided it remained orderly. Gambling involving excessive sums, however, sometimes created financial hardship, unpaid debts, or neighborhood conflict. Consequently, certain towns regulated gaming during particular periods or prohibited specific forms of wagering altogether. The regulations differed widely from place to place. Road maintenance produced another endless source of disagreement. Heavy wagons gradually carved deep ruts into unpaved roads. Seasonal rains washed away bridges and culverts. Nearby landowners occasionally disputed responsibility for repairs. Because commerce depended upon passable roads, local courts frequently settled questions concerning maintenance obligations. A merchant delayed by an impassable bridge suffered financial loss. Farmers unable to transport grain faced similar difficulties. Infrastructure, although rarely glamorous, remained essential. Perhaps most revealing are the cases that never reached dramatic conclusions. Many ended with negotiated settlements. Neighbors agreed to rebuild shared fences together. Debtors promised repayment according to manageable schedules. Families exchanged modest compensation for accidental damage. The surviving records reveal compromise far more often than harsh punishment. This challenges one of the most persistent myths about medieval justice. Popular imagination frequently portrays the Middle Ages as an era of relentless severity, where every offense produced brutal consequences. Certainly harsh punishments existed for serious crimes, yet the overwhelming majority of everyday legal business involved ordinary people solving ordinary problems through procedures surprisingly recognizable today. Listening patiently, examining evidence, questioning witnesses, seeking practical resolutions, protecting community relationships. These principles appeared again and again throughout local courts across Europe as twilight settled over villages after another court day concluded. Most participants returned home carrying tools, baskets, or bundles of firewood rather than lingering resentment. Fields still required tending. Animals still needed feeding. Bread still had to be baked before morning. Life continued much as before, and perhaps that was the greatest success of medieval law. Its most important purpose was rarely creating dramatic courtroom moments. Instead, it quietly helped thousands of communities continue functioning from one season to the next. Yet among all these familiar disputes lay another collection of laws that modern readers often find almost unbelievable, not because they governed everyday life, but because they attempted to regulate celebrations themselves. Feasts, tournaments, dancing, drinking, seasonal festivals, and public games all came under legal scrutiny in ways that reveal a medieval world where even moments of joy occasionally required permission, careful supervision, and rules that could seem wonderfully strange to 21st century eyes. The arrival of a festival could transform an ordinary medieval town almost beyond recognition. Streets that only yesterday echoed with the steady rhythm of wagons and merchants suddenly filled with musicians, brightly colored banners, wandering entertainers, and the cheerful voices of visitors arriving from surrounding villages. Bakers prepared extra loaves before sunrise. Brewers rolled heavy barrels toward market squares. Children stared in amazement at traveling performers, while craftsmen decorated stalls with ribbons, greenery, and painted signs. After weeks or months of predictable routine, these celebrations offered precious opportunities to rest, trade, socialize, and forget the demands of everyday labor. Yet beneath the laughter and excitement, local officials watched carefully. They knew from long experience that whenever large crowds gathered, unusual problems followed close behind. Arguments became easier after generous amounts of ale. Pickpockets blended effortlessly into busy marketplaces. Horses frightened by loud music occasionally bolted through crowded streets. Merchants disputed stall locations. Gambling debts accumulated. Wandering performers attracted enormous audiences that blocked narrow roads. Consequently, medieval governments responded with an astonishing variety of laws designed to regulate celebration itself. To modern readers, the idea of needing legal permission to organize a festival may seem surprisingly restrictive. To medieval authorities, however, careful planning represented common sense. A poorly managed gathering could disrupt trade, damage property, spread illness, or even provoke violence between rival communities. Imagine arriving in a prosperous French town during the annual fair, weeks before the event begins. Preparations quietly reshape the entire community. Temporary stalls appear around the marketplace. Extra supplies of grain, meat, fish, cheese, and ale arrive from neighboring villages. Innkeepers prepare additional beds. Stable owners clear space for visiting horses. Officials inspect bridges and gates, knowing that thousands of travelers may soon pass through them. The fair lasts only a short time. Its success depends entirely upon order. One surprisingly common legal requirement concerned the opening and closing of market activities. Bells often announced exactly when trading could begin each morning. Merchants who attempted to sell goods before the official opening occasionally risked penalties because authorities wanted every trader to compete under equal conditions. Likewise, selling after officially designated hours sometimes violated local regulations. These rules prevented a handful of merchants from secretly negotiating favorable deals before competitors had even unpacked their wagons. The allocation of stall space generated another fascinating collection of laws. Suppose two cloth merchants both wished to occupy the busiest corner near the entrance to the marketplace. That location promised greater visibility and more customers. Without clear rules, arguments would quickly follow. Town officials therefore assigned spaces according to long-established customs, guild membership, previous attendance, or carefully organized rotations. Some fairs maintained written records showing exactly where each merchant belonged year after year. Traveling entertainers faced their own legal restrictions. Musicians, storytellers, jugglers, acrobats, puppeteers, and animal trainers attracted enthusiastic crowds throughout medieval Europe. Yet authorities occasionally required performers to obtain permission before appearing publicly. The reason was not always censorship. Large audiences could block important roads, interfere with commercial activity, or create opportunities for theft. Officials wanted entertainment. They also wanted traffic to continue moving. Certain festivals included mock tournaments or athletic competitions. Archery contests became particularly popular in parts of England, where governments actively encouraged practice because skilled archers remained valuable during wartime. Remarkably, some medieval laws required able-bodied men to practice archery regularly, while discouraging excessive participation in games considered less useful for national defense. To modern readers, it feels extraordinary that recreational choices could become matters of public policy. Yet medieval rulers viewed military preparedness as everyone's responsibility. Football produced another wonderfully unusual legal story. The medieval version looked very little like the organized sport known today. Instead of carefully marked fields and fixed numbers of players, entire neighborhoods sometimes participated in enormous contests, stretching through streets, fields, and village boundaries. The ball itself varied considerably. Rules differed from place to place. Matches occasionally became energetic enough to damage fences, market stalls, windows, and gardens. Some towns responded by restricting or temporarily banning these games within crowded areas. These prohibitions were not necessarily attempts to eliminate recreation altogether. Rather, officials hoped to prevent injuries and protect valuable property. One can easily imagine the frustration of a merchant whose carefully arranged display of pottery disappeared beneath an enthusiastic crowd chasing a leather ball through the marketplace. Dancing also attracted legal attention. Many religious festivals naturally included music and communal dancing. Most authorities accepted these traditions as important expressions of local culture. However, certain celebrations gradually extended far into the night, accompanied by generous drinking and growing disorder. Some municipalities therefore established specific hours after which public dancing had to end. Others prohibited dancing in particular locations, considered inappropriate or dangerous. Alehouses and taverns generated perhaps the largest number of festival regulations. These establishments formed the social heart of many communities. Travelers exchanged news. Merchants negotiated agreements. Neighbors celebrated weddings and harvests. Pilgrims rested before continuing long journeys. Yet excessive drinking frequently accompanied successful festivals. Innkeepers occasionally received instructions limiting serving hours during especially crowded events. Some towns required alehouses to close temporarily after evening bells. Others prohibited gambling within drinking establishments during major fairs. Again, the goal centered upon preserving order rather than eliminating enjoyment. Weights and measures received even closer supervision during festivals than at ordinary markets. Temporary visitors, unfamiliar with local customs, proved especially vulnerable to dishonest practices. Inspectors therefore examined scales, measuring rods, and standardized containers before trading began. A merchant discovered using altered equipment might face immediate fines or expulsion from the fair. Honest commerce protected the reputation of the entire town. Pilgrimage festivals created another fascinating legal landscape. Across medieval Europe, famous shrines attracted enormous numbers of visitors seeking spiritual comfort, healing, or religious devotion. These gatherings stimulated local economies while simultaneously challenging civic administration. Authorities organized temporary sanitation measures. Additional guards patrolled busy streets. Special regulations governed accommodation, food prices, and access to sacred sites. Some towns even prohibited certain commercial activities immediately surrounding important churches to preserve a respectful atmosphere. Animal markets introduced still more unusual rules. Farmers buying or selling horses, cattle, sheep, or pigs expected fair dealing. Officials occasionally appointed inspectors capable of recognizing obvious signs of illness or concealed injuries. Selling a horse while deliberately hiding serious defects could result in legal consequences. Interestingly, many medieval legal systems recognized that no inspection could reveal every problem. Responsibility often depended upon whether defects had been intentionally concealed or honestly unknown at the time of sale. Fireworks did not exist in most of medieval Europe as they do today, but bonfires certainly did. Seasonal celebrations frequently featured large communal fires, symbolizing religious feasts, changing seasons, or local traditions. Authorities naturally regulated their location. A poorly placed bonfire near timber buildings represented an obvious danger. Some towns designated permanent sites well away from crowded neighborhoods. Others appointed supervisors responsible for ensuring flames remained safely contained. Masks and disguises occasionally appeared during carnival celebrations. These delighted participants, but worried officials. Hidden identities made accountability more difficult. Consequently, certain cities limited where masked individuals could gather or prohibited carrying weapons while disguised. These regulations reflected practical concerns rather than simple suspicion. Commerce depended heavily upon trust. People preferred knowing whom they were dealing with. One especially charming category of festival law involved wandering musicians, rather than allowing unrestricted performances everywhere. Some towns granted exclusive rights to officially recognized civic musicians. Traveling entertainers entering the city either obtained permission or limited performances to specific occasions. The arrangement protected local professionals whose livelihoods depended upon public celebrations. Guilds also participated actively in festivals. Craft organizations proudly sponsored processions, displaying banners embroidered with symbols of their trade. Blacksmiths, carpenters, bakers, weavers, and masons marched together during important civic occasions. Detailed regulations determined the order of procession, ensuring long-standing rivalries did not disrupt ceremonial dignity. To outsiders, arguing over who marched first might seem wonderfully trivial. To medieval guild members, however, procession order reflected honor earned through generations of skilled work. Even the ringing of church bells occasionally became regulated during major celebrations. Different patterns announced markets, religious services, emergencies, victories, funerals, or approaching visitors. Unauthorized bell ringing could create widespread confusion. Imagine hearing what everyone believes to be the alarm for fire, only to discover someone had pulled the rope as a joke. Authorities understandably discouraged such behavior. Perhaps the most remarkable feature of medieval festivals lies in their careful balance between freedom and supervision. People genuinely enjoyed themselves. They danced, they sang, they traded stories with strangers. Children watched acrobats. Families shared meals. Pilgrims met companions from distant kingdoms. Communities celebrated successful harvests and important religious feasts. At the same time, local governments quietly maintained the invisible framework, allowing these gatherings to remain safe and prosperous. Many of those regulations appear oddly specific today, precisely because they emerged from repeated experience. Somewhere at some earlier festival, a horse had probably escaped. Someone had likely cheated customers using false weights. A bonfire may have spread too close to nearby buildings. Two merchants almost certainly argued over stall locations. The law remembered these incidents long after the individuals involved had disappeared from history. As the last lanterns gradually dimmed and travelers began the slow journey home, medieval towns returned to their familiar routines. Market stalls disappeared. Streets grew quiet once more. Yet another world of unusual laws still awaited beyond the celebrations, a world hidden inside monasteries, cathedrals, and church courts, where spiritual authority and everyday life often overlapped in ways that could surprise even the most experienced traveler. There, some of the strangest legal customs of the Middle Ages would reveal how faith, community, and law became woven together into a single, remarkably intricate system. By the time the excitement of the great fairs had faded, and merchants once again disappeared along dusty roads leading toward distant kingdoms, another rhythm quietly returned to medieval life. Church bells marked the passing of each day with remarkable consistency. Dawn prayers welcomed the morning. Midday bells interrupted labor in fields and workshops. Evening prayers signaled that another day was drawing to a close. Whether someone lived inside a crowded city or a remote farming village, the church shaped the calendar as thoroughly as the changing seasons themselves. Unsurprisingly, this influence also extended into the law, creating a legal world that often feels unfamiliar to modern readers. Many people today imagine that medieval courts formed one unified system. In reality, different kinds of courts frequently existed side by side. Royal courts dealt with certain matters. Local manorial courts handled others. Merchant courts resolved commercial disputes during fairs. Alongside all of these stood the church courts, which possessed authority over an entirely different range of issues. To someone arriving from the 21st century, their responsibilities might seem surprisingly broad. Imagine a young merchant from York traveling to Canterbury on business. Along the journey, he hears that two neighboring villages have become involved in a legal dispute. Expecting a disagreement over farmland or livestock, he instead discovers that the matter concerns a promise made before witnesses during an engagement ceremony. Rather than appearing before the local lord, the couple must answer questions before a church court. Marriage, after all, was regarded not merely as a private agreement, but as a sacred institution. This meant church officials often determined whether a marriage had been entered into legally, whether promises exchanged between couples were binding, or whether close family relationships prevented a marriage altogether. These cases rarely resembled dramatic courtroom scenes portrayed in modern films. Instead, witnesses quietly described conversations remembered from months or even years earlier. Who heard the promise? Exactly what words were spoken? Were both individuals free to marry? Did either family object? Such questions occupied judges for hours because written contracts remained uncommon among ordinary villagers. Memory became one of the most valuable forms of evidence. Neighbors frequently remembered details that the participants themselves had nearly forgotten. One elderly woman might recall seeing the couple exchange rings beneath a church porch during harvest season. Another witness remembered hearing promises while attending a wedding feast nearby. Small observations gradually formed the foundation of legal decisions, perhaps even stranger to modern readers were the laws concerning oaths. Throughout medieval Europe, an oath carried extraordinary importance. Speaking falsely after invoking God was believed to endanger not only one's reputation, but one's soul. Consequently, legal systems often relied heavily upon sworn testimony. Breaking an oath could damage a person's standing within the community for years. In certain situations, individuals unable to produce physical evidence instead gathered oath helpers. These were respectable members of the community, willing to swear that they believed the accused person spoke truthfully. Modern courts generally rely upon documents, forensic evidence, and expert testimony. Medieval justice often depended upon character. If neighbors trusted someone's honesty after decades of shared experience, that reputation itself possessed legal value. Confession also occupied a fascinating place within church law. Modern readers naturally associate confession with religious practice rather than legal procedure. Yet medieval confession occasionally intersected with broader questions of justice, morality, and community responsibility. Priests encouraged reconciliation before conflicts became permanent. Arguments between neighbors, family disagreements, broken promises, many problems ended quietly through mediation, long before reaching formal courts. Not every dispute required punishment. Sometimes restoring peace mattered far more. Another curious legal custom involved church sanctuaries. Imagine a frightened traveler running desperately through narrow streets. After becoming involved in a violent confrontation, rather than continuing indefinitely, the pursuit suddenly stops as the individual crosses the threshold of a church. Why? Because many medieval churches possessed the ancient right of sanctuary. This tradition did not erase crimes, nor did it automatically grant permanent freedom. Instead, it created a temporary place of protection where immediate violence ceased, while authorities considered the next steps. Different kingdoms developed different procedures. In parts of England, someone claiming sanctuary might remain inside the church for a limited period before deciding either to stand trial or accept exile from the kingdom. The system appears unusual today, yet it reflected an important medieval belief that even moments of crisis required opportunities for reflection rather than uncontrolled revenge. Sanctuary occasionally produced remarkable scenes. Church officials negotiated with royal representatives. Family members visited the individual seeking refuge. Neighbors debated what had truly happened. Communities searched for solutions, balancing justice with mercy. The legal process slowed deliberately. Education also fell under substantial church influence. Cathedral schools and monasteries preserved much of Europe's written knowledge throughout the early Middle Ages. Consequently, laws concerning books sound particularly surprising. Handwritten manuscripts required months, or even years, of careful labor. Each page was copied individually. Decorated initials received elaborate illustrations. Leather bindings protected completed volumes. Because producing books demanded enormous effort, stealing one represented a far greater loss than taking an ordinary household object. Some libraries attached written warnings to valuable manuscripts, although popular culture sometimes calls these book curses. Many functioned as serious reminders that anyone removing books unlawfully committed both theft and moral wrongdoing. To modern readers, placing solemn warnings inside books may seem unusual. To medieval librarians who had devoted years to copying a single manuscript, the practice made perfect sense. Church bells themselves generated fascinating regulations. They announced weddings, warned of fires, marked approaching storms, called communities together during emergencies, signaled important religious festivals, because bells communicated vital information across entire towns. Unauthorized ringing occasionally became a punishable offense. Imagine hearing the rapid alarm, usually reserved for fire. Families rush outside carrying buckets. Merchants abandon stalls. The night watch hurries toward the sound. Moments later, everyone discovers there is no emergency at all. Confusion alone justified careful supervision of bell towers. Burial law formed another, unexpectedly detailed area. Churchyards possessed limited space. Generations of families rested there together. Questions naturally arose. Who could be buried within particular areas? How should graves be maintained? What happened if old burial grounds reached capacity? Different dioceses developed different customs, but all treated these matters with profound seriousness. Pilgrimage inspired still more remarkable regulations. Throughout medieval Europe, millions of people traveled to famous shrines seeking healing, forgiveness, or spiritual renewal. Pilgrims often carried distinctive badges showing where they had traveled. Some routes developed legal protections, ensuring travelers could move relatively safely. Hospitals and charitable hostels offered shelter. Bridges received maintenance because pilgrimage routes brought valuable trade alongside religious visitors. Even disputes involving pilgrims occasionally received special consideration because they were far from home. Fasting regulations created another curious legal landscape. The medieval calendar contained numerous days when eating meat was discouraged or prohibited according to church practice. This affected not only households, but entire markets. Fish became especially valuable during fasting periods. Merchants adjusted supplies accordingly. Monasteries expanded fish ponds. Coastal communities experienced increased demand. Thus, Thus, religious observance quietly influenced economic life across enormous regions. Monastic communities themselves followed detailed internal rules that modern readers might easily mistake for legal codes. Every aspect of daily life received careful attention. When to wake, when to pray, when to eat, how long silence should be observed, how books were borrowed, how guests were welcomed. Even the arrangement of sleeping quarters often followed written regulations refined across centuries. These rules aimed less at punishment than at creating orderly communal life. Perhaps one of the most interesting features of church law was its international character. A merchant traveling from England to northern France encountered different languages, different rulers, and different local customs. Yet many church traditions remained recognizable. Latin connected educated clergy across Europe. Religious festivals followed familiar calendars. Basic legal principles concerning marriage or inheritance often displayed remarkable continuity despite political boundaries. In an age without unified nation-states, this shared framework helped create a surprising degree of consistency. Still, church authorities frequently encountered resistance. Local customs sometimes conflicted with official teachings. Ancient village traditions survived alongside newer religious practices. Communities negotiated compromises gradually rather than changing overnight. This slow evolution explains why medieval law appears so wonderfully layered. Older customs remained visible beneath newer regulations. Roman legal ideas mixed with Germanic traditions. Royal decrees overlapped with local practice. Church law intersected constantly with secular authority. The result was not a single legal system, but a living tapestry woven from centuries of experience. As evening settled over monastery gardens and the final bells echoed across quiet fields, another realization gradually emerged. Many of the strangest medieval laws were never intended to seem strange at all. They reflected practical solutions to problems that surrounded everyday life. Yet there remained one final category of regulations. Unlike any we have encountered so far, laws created to govern the animals themselves. Not merely their owners, but actual court proceedings in which pigs, horses, dogs, rats, and even insects sometimes found themselves at the center of astonishing legal cases. Those extraordinary stories, preserved in surviving records across medieval Europe, would become some of the most unforgettable chapters in the long and curious history of medieval law. As our journey approaches its final quiet chapter, we arrive at one of the most surprising corners of medieval legal history. After exploring forests, markets, marriages, festivals, monasteries, and village courts, we now encounter stories that sound almost too unusual to be true. Yet preserved in fragile manuscripts and legal records are accounts showing that, on rare occasions, Medieval courts held proceedings involving animals themselves. Modern readers often hear these stories and immediately assume they must be legends. The reality is more complicated. Historians continue debating exactly how some of these trials operated, how frequently they occurred, and how seriously every participant regarded them. What is beyond dispute is that enough contemporary records survive to demonstrate that animals occasionally appeared in legal proceedings across parts of medieval Europe, particularly in France, Switzerland, and neighboring regions. To understand why, we must once again leave behind modern assumptions. Imagine a prosperous farming village during the late 15th century. Every household depends upon livestock. Pigs wander through lanes searching for scraps. Chickens scratch beneath fences. Horses pull wagons loaded with grain. Oxen plow heavy fields. Dogs guard sheep from predators. Animals are not simply companions. They are valuable economic partners. Their behavior directly affects human survival. Now imagine that one afternoon, a serious tragedy occurs. A pig roaming freely through the village fatally injures a small child. Such accidents, although uncommon, did happen. Medieval authorities faced a difficult question. How should justice respond, rather than treating the event purely as property damage? Certain courts initiated formal legal proceedings. Witnesses described what happened. Officials examined the circumstances. Records identified the owner. In some remarkable cases, the animal itself became the symbolic defendant. Modern legal historians generally believe these proceedings reflected several overlapping purposes. First, they publicly demonstrated that serious harm could not simply be ignored. Second, they reminded owners of their responsibilities. Third, they reaffirmed that law governed the community, even after shocking events. To 21st century observers, putting an animal on trial appears irrational. To medieval communities, the ceremony itself reinforced confidence that justice remained active despite tragedy. One of the most frequently discussed examples concerns a sow tried in Normandy during the late 14th century after a fatal attack upon an infant. Surviving documents describe witnesses, officials, and punishment carried out under legal authority, although modern readers naturally focus upon the unusual defendant. Medieval observers likely concentrated far more upon restoring public order following a deeply disturbing event. Not every animal trial involved violence. Some cases addressed damage to crops. Others concerned destruction of valuable property. Even more astonishing are records describing legal proceedings against swarms of insects. Yes, insects. Imagine vineyards suffering devastating destruction from caterpillars or beetles. Entire harvests begin disappearing. Families fear economic ruin. Scientific knowledge capable of explaining insect life cycles remains centuries away. Communities search desperately for every available response. In several documented cases, church courts held symbolic proceedings requesting harmful insects leave cultivated land. Representatives even argued on behalf of the insects in certain famous examples. Modern historians emphasize that these ceremonies should not be interpreted literally, as people believing insects understood legal arguments. Instead, the proceedings reflected medieval ideas about divine order, morality, and humanity's relationship with the natural world. The legal ritual expressed hope that every available spiritual and communal response had been attempted before accepting devastating losses. Another curious legal tradition involved wandering livestock. Throughout much of medieval Europe, pigs roamed freely through town streets, eating discarded food. From a practical perspective, this reduced waste. From another perspective, it created constant opportunities for trouble. Town councils repeatedly issued regulations requiring owners to supervise animals more carefully. Some municipalities prohibited pigs from particular streets. Others required wooden yokes, preventing them from squeezing through fences. Still others imposed increasingly larger fines upon repeat offenders. Reading successive town ordinances, historians sometimes notice the same problem returning decade after decade. Apparently, medieval pigs possessed little respect for municipal regulations. Horses inspired a different set of legal concerns. A valuable horse represented years of savings for many families. Disputes over ownership therefore received careful attention. Branding marks, witness testimony, and long-established reputation often determined rightful possession. Imagine two merchants, each claiming the same horse during a busy market. Without registration papers or photographs, judges relied upon remarkably detailed descriptions. One witness remembered a distinctive white marking near the left shoulder. Another recalled an old injury suffered several years earlier. A third identified custom-made harness fittings. Gradually, tiny observations formed convincing evidence. Dogs, meanwhile, occupied an increasingly important place within medieval society. Hunting dogs represented significant investments. Sheepdogs protected valuable flocks. Household dogs guarded homes after sunset. Laws frequently distinguished between these different roles. A hunting dog entering protected royal forests illegally could create serious complications. A shepherd's dog received entirely different treatment. Even cats occasionally appear within surviving records. Unlike dogs or horses, cats rarely attracted direct legal attention. Instead, they quietly contributed to everyday urban life by controlling rodents in granaries, warehouses, monasteries, and homes. Without realizing it, medieval communities depended heavily upon their presence. One especially fascinating aspect of medieval law is how often responsibility ultimately returned to people rather than animals. Although animal trials attract modern attention because of their unusual appearance, most legal systems focused primarily upon human obligations: who failed to repair the fence, who allowed livestock to wander, who neglected supervision, who ignored previous warnings. Behind almost every strange case stood ordinary questions concerning responsibility. That pattern has appeared throughout our entire journey. The law regulating forests protected resources essential for survival. The law governing clothing reflected social organization. Market regulations encouraged fair trade. Fire ordinances reduced catastrophe. Marriage customs protected families. Festival rules maintained public order. Even the famous animal trials sought, in their own distinctive way, to reassure communities that justice had not disappeared. The more closely we examine medieval laws, the less bizarre many of them become. At first glance, they appear wonderfully strange. On closer inspection, they reveal familiar concerns. People worried about safety. They worried about fairness. They worried about protecting children, preserving harvests, preventing disasters, resolving disagreements, and maintaining peace among neighbors. Those concerns have never truly disappeared. Only the solutions have changed. Perhaps that is the greatest lesson hidden within these ancient legal manuscripts. History rarely shows us people who were fundamentally different from ourselves. Instead, it introduces us to individuals solving timeless problems, using the knowledge, beliefs, and institutions available in their own age. Sometimes their answers seem wise. Sometimes they seem misguided. Often they seem surprisingly creative. Nearly always they remind us that every legal system reflects the society that creates it. 1,000 years from now, future historians may study our own laws with equal curiosity. They may wonder why we organized cities as we did, why we debated certain questions so passionately, why we considered some rules obvious while others appeared controversial. Every generation believes its legal system perfectly sensible. History gently reminds us that perspective changes with time. As the last candles burn low inside the village hall, the court records are carefully rolled shut. The market grows silent. Distant church bells fade into the evening air, and the roads leading through forests slowly disappear beneath the gathering mist. Medieval Europe settles once more into quiet darkness, carrying with it countless forgotten lives, remarkable customs, and laws that still inspire curiosity centuries later. Sleep comes more easily when we remember that history is not merely a collection of kings, battles, and castles. It is also the story of ordinary people trying, day after day, to build orderly communities in an uncertain world. Their laws, however unusual they appear today, were simply another chapter in that timeless human effort. If you want to continue the journey, the next video is waiting.